To think she's only been out of power for 3 years. And while no one expects Angela Merkel's fans to issue calls to make Germany great again, the buzz surrounding the release of her memoirs illustrates nostalgia for a leader whose modern-day record for longevity was a symbol of stability and success. Her successor, who came in during the pandemic, has now seen his coalition collapse as the powerhouse of Europe reels and Olaf Scholz tries to manage an export-driven model rocked by the end of cheap Russian gas and stiff Chinese competition. Even though he's a social democrat and she's a conservative, voters chose Scholz in 2021 because the former mayor of Hamburg most resembled the no-drama, safe pair of hands that preceded him. So, what is Merkel's actual legacy today? We'll ask about her handling of Vladimir Putin, of a Donald Trump who's about to return, some say with vengeance, to the White House, and of a European Union that's grown markedly more anti-immigrant and nationalist. How much of today's ills are on her? Will the EU's reluctant hegemon rise to the challenge the next time the bloc faces a major crisis? Today in the France 24 debate, we are revisiting the Merkel years. With us from Hohenstein in Germany, Klaus-Peter Wilsch, member of the German parliament from Merkel's CDU party. Thank you for being with us.
Hello, everybody.
From Berlin, he was diplomatic advisor to Merkel's predecessor, Helmut Kohl, former German ambassador to NATO, Joachim Bitterlich. Thank you for joining us.
Good evening, Paris.
Vivian Walt, Paris correspondent for Time magazine, who followed the Merkel years throughout. Good to see you.
Good to see you.
Famke Krummüller is the head of geostrategy at consultants EY. Welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Your reactions on the hashtag F24 debate. Regrets, well, she said very few, as one review notes. Memoirs, by the way, are, as a general rule, kind of self-serving. Still, the release of this book at this moment in time, certainly an event, and an event beyond Germany's borders. Morgan Eyre has more.
In a now infamous moment in 2017, when then President Donald Trump refused to shake her hand in front of cameras, the former Chancellor says in her new memoir that the President's actions were deliberate.
Trump knew precisely what he was doing. He wanted to give people something to talk about with his behaviour, while I had acted as though I were having a conversation with someone completely normal.
She went on to say that Trump claimed she had ruined Germany and that he was fascinated by Russian President Vladimir Putin.
I had the distinct impression he was captivated by politicians with autocratic and dictatorial tendencies.
On Putin himself and their many meetings, Merkel said he was
someone who was always on guard not to be treated badly and always ready to dish out punishment, including power games with a dog and making others wait.
She's referring to a meeting in Russia in 2007 when President Putin brought his Labrador, despite knowing about Merkel's fear of dogs. In her book, Merkel also defends some of her decisions during her 16 years as Chancellor. One of those moments she reflects on is a NATO summit in 2008, when President George W. Bush declared his desire to extend membership to Georgia and Ukraine. Angela Merkel and other European colleagues opposed it. The ex-Chancellor explains her resistance to include the former Soviet states in NATO, saying it would have pushed Putin to act more aggressively to prevent Ukraine from joining the alliance.
Klaus-Peter Wilsch, any surprises with the release of this memoir?
I haven't read them yet, but what I'm reading about it, there's nothing very surprising. You know, I've been with her all those years. I'm a member of parliament since '98. And I can follow a lot of lines that say we have not done enough for our defense. I was always fighting for spending 2% of national income for our defense. They were successful in reaching that. But anyway, I have been with her all these years, saw her, have acted with her, lived with her, struggled with her and all that. Of course, I will get the book and look what's written there. But I think as a party, we have come over those times. We have a new leading person with Friedrich Merz, who's well known in the Atlantic scene, and also very clear in his diction of saying we have to take care for our security, we have to strengthen our economy, and we have to take care for interior security in our country, and solving we have to solve the migration topic, the illegal migration topic.
Yeah, we'll look forward to talking about how things are going forward, especially with those snap elections coming up. Joachim Bitterlich, I know that in German, when people look back with fondness at the past, when it comes to the former East Germany, they employ this term Ostalgie, a play on words, the fact that it's the former East Germany. She harbors, by the way, none of that in her book. She has zero fondness for growing up on the wrong side, if you read her memoirs, of the Iron Curtain. When you look at her memoirs today, when you look at who Angela Merkel is today, what does she represent?
Well, she has been one of the longest lasting German chancellors in the past, yes. But it's always easy to criticize someone afterwards, after the period. You have to look what's the real balance of the Merkel years. She needed in her beginnings a certain time to become a real politician. For me, she needed about 4 years. She became really in the center of politics from 95 on, and then she took over the party in 2002, putting aside all her competitors. And then, in my eyes, when you look at her past, it was often crisis management, yes, often a successful crisis management, but a crisis management looking at short term. She assured stability, yes, but what's missing to me is what I call the difficult heritage. Her successor, Olaf Scholz, had to take over when he came into power in an extremely difficult situation. And now we have to be aware that Germany as a whole is in a bad shape. We need in reality today what I call a big bang to reboost Germany, and you may even look at the different areas where Merkel has been acting. I take one example. I have full understanding for her behavior in the refugees crisis in 2015. What she did, what's missing to me is where have been, let's say, the real consequences to get this movement under control. Because if you look today at Germany, Germany is in the subject of migration, internal security, in a more defensive position, which allows reinforcing the extremes in Germany. AfD. We have a similar situation, by the way, in France with AN. And this is an example of Merkel. But the more stringent example is the shape of the German economy, where we have not understood in the last, let's say, 5-6 years, the change of the world economy, the change around us. And now Germany has, in reality, to reinvent its economic model.
Reinvent the economic model. We're going to talk about that in a moment. First, though, let's talk about Famke Krummüller. When you think of the Merkel years, what's the first thing that springs to mind? Because we've already heard about the letting the migrants in 2015. We've talked, the financial crisis. We've talked about security issues. What is the defining moment, would you say, of the Merkel years?
I think this might be a personal interpretation because I worked very much on it at the time, was the sovereign debt crisis.
and she obviously played a huge role during that time. And the legacy result of that is still with us now and is top of the agenda now again, which is the debt brake debate about the German debt brake. Obviously, it was implemented before the sovereign debt crisis hit, but the German stance at the time around fiscal consolidation being very central, etc., is now, in after years of crisis and not investing enough, etc., coming back, and now we have debates about the debt brake in Germany and reform around it. This is the first thing that currently comes to mind when I think about it.
We're going to talk about that debt brake in a moment. Back in 2013, Vivian Walt, you, for Time magazine, wrote a feature where you described that 16-year mainstay of Brussels, an EU summit that features Angela Merkel. As she milled about chatting with other leaders, she was not only the most important leader in the room, but also the consummate political survivor, having seen enraged voters throw out so many other leaders in punishment for their crisis management. In the article, you cite names that are now seem like ancient history: Gordon Brown, Nicolas Sarkozy, but she
And many after.
and many others. But 3 years out, she still has cast a long shadow over Germany and Europe.
She does. And I think what's so striking, and maybe I'm speaking here as the one non-German on this panel, what's so striking is that for the outside world, she did become the figure of Europe. There was always the old kind of joke of Henry Kissinger, if you want to call Europe, who do you phone? And when Angela Merkel came onto the scene, the answer was clear. She was the leader of Europe. She was the most powerful. But what strikes me really, even 3 years out after she retired, is, yes, she was hugely powerful. She represented the most powerful economy in Europe, one of the most powerful economies in the world. And yet her kind of understatedness, so almost kind of, soft-spoken, like almost, apologetic sort of personality did not suit the time. She did not kind of rise to an age in which big personalities really were needed. The rise of Putin needed to be met with somebody in Europe who was feisty and outspoken and challenging. And that was not Angela Merkel at all. And I think that we have paid the price for that in some ways.
Is that on Angela Merkel, or is that on the way Germans like their politicians?
I was just going to make that point, and I think we have a similar example currently in power, and I do think it's an important reflection of who the people vote for sure. Second point, in terms of her being criticized so much these days, I do think it is easy to look back now and say, well, we shouldn't have done this at the time. At the time, she had the backing for a lot of the things that she did by the German population. She was hugely popular by her party, of course. And even though she was very powerful, it's not a presidential system like, for example, in France, much more consensual, etc. So I think all of these things need to be moderated.
Gerhard, go ahead.
Take the example of energy policy.
Well, let's talk about that. By the time she left office,
She refers.
By the time she left office, Joachim Bitterlich, Russia accounted for 55% of Germany's gas imports, up from a little under 41% when she became chancellor. So when you think about
now
Nord
the
Stream
number
2,
one in Europe is France.
well, just the question about, did she, even after the annexation of Crimea, could she have done things differently when it came to energy policy?
Well, the interesting thing is she refers to what they call the lack of a majority in Germany to change the orientation on energy policy, including the imports from Russia. But what I would have been expecting, at least now, 3 years after her departure, I would have been expecting a certain, let's say, partly a mea culpa, if you want. Not a strong one, but she has been part of, let's say, of a system in Germany. And therefore, she could perhaps have said, well, we should have been reflecting further. Because it's interesting, in 2004, she has been referring in front of her own party the risks of a too great dependence on Russia on cheap energy imports. But on the other hand, German economy was in favor. It was, let's say, one of the cornerstones of the German export-oriented economy. And at the same time, well, latest with, let's say, the occupation of Crimea and then of the failure of the Minsk agreements, I would have expected a real change in politics from her.
Klaus-Peter Wilsch?
No, the whole difficulty.
Yeah.
Just picking up, do you agree with Joachim Bitterlich?
Yes, totally. You know, in terms of security, of defense questions, it was, I remember very well, it was George Bush Sr. who told us, you are invited to leadership, responsibility in leadership. Of course, he meant we should do more for our own defense. And no government in Germany accepted this. It was always cheaper and more comfortable to spend more money on social purposes and all that, instead of taking care for the old security. And the way she put in her resume for making acceptance for her really sole decision to say, let them come all in 2015. If she had put the same resume on the question of convincing people to spend more money for defense purposes, she would have succeeded, but she didn't.
Because you had, Vivian Walt, that bold decision
Exactly.
After Fukushima
Right.
to end nuclear power.
Which turned out to be a disastrous decision. She was obviously deeply suspicious always of nuclear power coming from East Germany, you know, and with the kind of Soviet education that she'd had. But energy-wise, it turned out to be a real misstep. And as far as I can tell, I've not read the 721 pages of this book, and I'm not sure I'll get around to doing so. But as far as I can tell, she does not, as Joachim says, she does not have a strong mea culpa in which she says, I made mistakes and I wish I could have done things differently. Now, why did she make those mistakes? I'm not sure. When I went back to do that profile those years ago, one thing that did strike me going to her hometown and speaking to people who had known her for many years, she had tended to be seen as a kind of accidental politician. She kind of stumbled into politics after the fall of the Berlin Wall, mostly because she was unemployed and looking for a job. And then kind of rose through the ranks.
Trained as a scientist, but instead goes...
Exactly. She did not join the celebrations when the Berlin Wall came down. She was kind of a bookish, you know, nose to the grindstone type. And, you know, her school friends had said they were kind of astonished that she was sort of this retiring, one quarter almost invisible sort of personality. So to have emerged and, you know, after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the incredible events of the 2010s that we saw with Crimea and so on, the rise of Putin, maybe she was not the best suited for that moment.
Yet she left power popular.
I just want to quickly react to that, not to necessarily defend her legacy, but to just state some facts, which I think it's easy to forget with just these couple of years and how much the world has changed, is that her energy policy at the time, the nuclear exit, was hugely popular in Germany. Even the households at the time that were facing the higher costs from the renewable energy were still in favor of that type of energy policy. So she was totally in line with popular opinion on that.
No,
and also at the time...
That's not true.
But with a sleeping opposition.
I do remember the polls from the time, turns out, because I was working on it, so I'm very sure that that's true. And the second point is, on defense spending, for example, today that's a no-brainer with what has happened in Europe in the past 2.5 years. But at the time, there would have from kind of the average German population, there wouldn't have been support to spend so much on defense. I just think it's worth to recalling these 2 points. The other point that I quickly do want to make, and I think that's important when we look at the relationship with Russia at the time and the gas, and now the relationship with, for example, China, is the power and the importance of German industry, who was very happy at the time to rely on cheap energy coming from Russia, and who's now very much relying on the export market in China.
Yeah. Cheap German industry, German heavy industry. If we fast forward, Famke, that's a perfect transition to 2024. Again, we're heading towards snap elections. This week began with the Social Democrats officially nominating incumbent Chancellor Olaf Scholz to be their lead candidate for those February snap elections. But the announcement overshadowed Monday by ThyssenKrupp's steel division announcing a 40% cut to its workforce. That's 11,000 jobs over the next 5 years. A further sign of how badly Germany and Europe's auto industries are reeling. Klaus Bader-Wilsch, this German model, and we see the images there of the Wolfsburg factory of Volkswagen. They're announcing closures of factories, which is something, I guess you could say, it's unprecedented where you are. This German model, could there have been more anticipation that it would come under duress?
Yeah, it's a problem of policy looking at the big entities, 10,000 jobs lost. And so if 10,000 companies lose 100 jobs each, it's the same thing. But of course, the focus of the public is very much more intensive on those big players. So we have those developments seen with Chrysler and other big shots as well. And of course, the failure of just depending on cheap gas from Russia and hoping for good exports to China and other countries was, well, of course, a comfortable and easy way to do it, but not a sustainable one. And
so how do you see the German model evolving now, Klaus Bader-Wilsch? What do you see happening next?
We have to work on a good energy supply in Germany.
Cheaper.
I don't hope for, of course, cheaper. I don't hope that, have no hopes that the Social Democrats bring anything forward there, because it was always the Social Democrats who have been in the last 20 years, 16 years in power. And they have been on this economic side with Gabriel giving the sources to the Russian, the Gazprom companies, or they're subsidized. And so we have to go our own way. We have to go back to nuclear power. We have to use our own resources, and we have to look if we are all alone on our way to thinking that everything goes with windmills and solar panels. We also need to have electricity and power supply in times like now, when there's no sun shining and there's no wind going, and we are paying 800 euros a megawatt at this times. And this is, of course, not a wise way to make your energy supply.
All right, so perhaps a return
it's
to
just one problem.
Perhaps a return to nuclear power. If Germany, by the way, is struggling to come up with the cash to fund its energy transition, its military, aging infrastructure, well, it's partly down to something that was mentioned earlier in the conversation, a constitutional amendment.
You mean debt break?
that was approved under Merkel, one that forbids deficits by German states and a miserly 0.35% of GDP at the federal level. Merkel, in her memoirs, up for reviewing the debt break. She says it needs to be reformed to allow higher levels of debt to be assumed for investment in the future. Joachim Bitterlich, your reaction?
No, this is wrong. Sorry.
She is right. She is right. But it comes a bit late. Because look at Germany. It's not only the crisis of what I call the export stars of the German economy, cars, chemical industry, machine construction, etc. It's at the same time, what's for me even more preoccupying, it's the crisis of a medium-sized industry in Germany, who say to me clearly, we do not invest anymore in Germany because of bureaucracy and energy costs. We prefer to invest directly in the US or somewhere in Asia. Where is
That's
the
true,
real challenge? To, let's
but
say, to
this is not-
rebuild a real German solid economy.
With all respect, Mr. Bitterlich,
Wakes up to
this
this.
is
Sorry,
not
go
a
ahead.
problem of this is not a problem of debt break. Also, to say this to Famke, who just put this point out, we are accepting a 1 trillion income from taxes next year. We would have it this year if our economy would have performed better, but next year or at latest, the year behind, we will have 1 trillion income with taxes.
So let me bring in.
Just let me make this point.
Sure.
The taxpayers are fed up with politicians coming around telling everyone we don't get around with this money. We need more money.
I agree.
Wrong.
I agree, but
we had a popular vote in Hessen, in my state of Hessen. We only can change the constitution with people's vote. 70% were voting for the debt break.
Herr Wilsch, I agree, but we could have accepted from the so-called Schuldenbremse security and defense. This would have been a real step forward.
So the whole
maintain
hold on.
the Schuldenbremse, accept security and defense.
Now the whole of Europe is watching this. The whole of Europe is watching this conversation.
We made a special debt permission for 100 billion euro for defense.
Famke Krummiller, the whole of Europe is the whole of Europe is watching this conversation because here in France right now we have to pay the piper because we have a big budget deficit. But during COVID, we had the whatever it costs policies of Emmanuel Macron, and we ran up that deficit. And the French are, as a result, well, their growth is a little bit higher than Germany's. I don't know if that's the sole reason, but it's the question of are the Germans going to stick to this debt break?
I think there's going to be reform of the debt break because I think there is now a realization, as reflected also by Merkel's comments, for example, that this level of strictness of the debt break does not allow for the level of investments that is needed for an economy. Now, that does not need that the country needs to go off into the other extreme. And there are a couple of points here, which is why is it so important, apart from not leaving too much debt for future generations, of course, is that also within the monetary union that we have in the Eurozone, where there's centralized monetary policy, but not centralized fiscal policy, you need countries to not diverge too much on their debt and deficit. Otherwise, the monetary union will break apart.
So Germany will have to play the grown-up in the room.
But so there is, as with everything in life, there needs to be measures here. And the challenge that Germany is facing now is that it has moved too far into one extreme with regards to that debt break in a context where we've seen years of crisis over the past couple of years. And the economy needs investment and it needs a reinvention, as you said.
All right, Merkel's early years in power coincided with, and you mentioned it, the financial crisis, which morphed into a Greek debt crisis. France's current minority government's at the mercy of a vote of no confidence. There's a genuine chance that either the left or the far right's Marine Le Pen could reject next year's budget here in the coming weeks. What that means for the rest of Europe is anyone's guess. Politico's headline braces for chaos. Marine Le Pen might be about to wreck the Eurozone. So we're possibly headed towards another big crisis, and it's happening, Vivian Walt, in this period of interregnum Germans are waiting on elections, and the U.S. is waiting for an inauguration.
Indeed. And the US, well, President-elect Trump has already announced that he will have 20% tariffs on EU imports. So something which I'm not sure the EU has begun to calculate the impact of. So yes, I mean, there is a lot of, shall we say, churn at the moment.
So you were talking about the need for strong leadership. Germany's strong leadership is also Europe's strong leadership going forward?
I don't think so. I mean, we will have to see, obviously, up to the German elections. But I think that Merkel's departure really did kind of leave something of a vacuum, which in some ways President Macron was able to fill simply by force of personality, his stature on the world stage. He speaks English. He knows a lot of people around the world, and he's now been in power for 7.5 years. So yes, he has filled that vacuum. But Merkel's departure was definitely, in my mind, a kind of turning point in Europe, in which Germany as a kind of world power really seemed somewhat diminished, and has only, further become so with its economic problems.
I mentioned at the outset of this conversation.
What is
Go ahead, very briefly, Joachim Birolich.
no, but this situation, this bad situation applies to Paris and to Berlin. Both are too weak. Look at the risks in Paris. The spread yesterday came up to the largest point since 2012. The risks of the French economy for the future are clear on the table. The same to the Germans. And what in reality the EU needs is a strong Berlin and Paris. But how to get this back? And the hope is perhaps, let's say, in March, April, we will perhaps find, let's say, a stronger Berlin. But the situation in Paris is preoccupying Berlin too.
Klaus Bedorwilsch, the period of consensus politics is over. That's the page that's being turned, and that whatever happens, both in Berlin and in Paris, you need strong leadership?
Yes, I'm quite sure that we had a lack of that in the last years. Remember the situation when Macron, on the day of our election, brought out his speech to Europe, and it was no German response there, nothing.
It's normal.
There were, of course, faults on the German side, really faults. And I hope that Merz will come into power, and he has really good relationship across the Atlantic, and also to France and to Poland. So I think we really need to have a strong center in Europe. And that's a point where I also look at the budget situation. When I see that this year France is heading for a 5.5 deficit, having some 110% of national income as a debt now as a state, and looking at the rates they get from the rating agencies,
France.
It's not really a good shape. Yeah, so that's why I'm really sticking to the debt brake and to the straight budget politic, because first, demographic situation, we all have less younger people.
And so there needs to be
having a big debt already from the generations before us. We'd have to take responsibility for our young people.
Responsibility. We're almost out of time. Famke Krummüller. So going forward, this picks up on Vivian Wald's point. The next leader of Germany will have to stand up to Donald Trump.
Yes, definitely. And I was just going to say exactly that. The main challenge right now is that Europe has a competitiveness problem in a world where Trump is coming in with his tariff policy that will hit Europe for sure, in a world where the Chinese economy, which is a big export market for European countries, certainly Germany, is struggling, and where the main solution to this would be European level action. We have the Draghi report, etc. So we need leadership in Europe, and we need some hard decision making. And unfortunately, right now, when you look at what's going on in Germany and France, it's nowhere to be seen.
All right. On that note,
but no mountains of debt.
We'll have to leave it there.
Let's hope for the best.
Let's hope for the best indeed. I want to thank you, Joachim Bitterlich in Berlin, Klaus Peter-Wilsch for joining us from Hesse. I want to thank as well Famke Krummiller, Vivian Walt. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.